What Pastor Chris and I are doing throughout this summer is to be able to take some of the movies that we see in the theater and take a look at a biblical theme that can match some of these movies. Now, when Jesus was on this earth, he did the same thing. He would go out on the countryside, he would meet with large numbers of people, and he would take the activities of their daily lives and use them as examples in order to show people how to live a Christian life. And so we're doing some of the same things, and I'm going to have a little fun this morning talking a little bit about this Jurassic World as well as some of the other movies that are related to it. Now, I have two questions for all of you this morning. Two questions, and I want you to think about them a little bit. The first question that I have for you is, how would you behave if your life just changed from tremendous to traumatic? Now think about that a little bit. I'm going to reread that again for you. How would you behave if suddenly your life just changed from tremendous to traumatic? Think about that a little bit. Now, the second question I have for you this morning is, and what is the reason behind that behavior? What is the reason behind that behavior? So things are going absolutely wonderful in your life, and you're thinking, boy, things are just great. I'm living the high life, and suddenly something goes incredibly wrong. And suddenly your life is totally different than it was before, and it's not the life that you were hoping for. How do you behave when that happens? Imagine yourself as to what that would be like for you and how you would act. And then ask yourself that question, why would I behave in that manner? Now, I want to use an example to help you here a little bit. And so I'm going to talk about a show that I enjoyed watching since I was very, very young. And hopefully some of you here will actually remember it. But it's called Gilligan's Island. Okay. I mean, they rerun it all the time. In fact, I asked my wife to program our TV so it would keep copying those shows that I watch over and over and over again that she gets so sick of that she can't stand anymore. But I really like Gilligan's Island. So let's think about if you were on a ship and you went for a 3-hour tour and the weather started getting rough and the tiny ship was tossed. And what happens? They ended up being stranded on a uncharted and a deserted island. So here is another thing to think about. Who would you be if you were one of the characters of Gilligan's Island? Would you be the skipper where everything is about brute strength? And therefore, the reason he behaves in the way that he behaves is because of his brute strength, and he has all the confidence because of that. Or would you be like Ginger, where you feel confident because you're good looking? And you spend your whole time on the island trying to keep good looking all the time. And that's where you get your confidence from, is from being good looking. Well, what about the professor? Is your confidence that you have in yourself, is the reason you behave the way you behave based on your intellect, your education, your knowledge? And so he gets stranded on this island, and he lives his life just stimulating that intellect that he has. Or are you going to be like Marianne, who's just good to everybody and bakes pies for everybody, coconut cream pies? Or would you be like the millionaire and his wife, where everything in his life is based on his wealth, and the confidence that he has in himself is based on that wealth, and the reason he behaves the way he behaves is based on that wealth? And even though his life has totally changed from living in a mansion to now living in a hut on an island, everything that he does on that island is based on his wealth. And so you think about that a little bit. Who are you going to be out of all those people? But now the last one, Gilligan. Are you going to be like Gilligan? Where the reason you behave the way you behave is because your emotions are up here one day and your emotions are down here the next day and your emotions are way up here the next day, and they go up and down and up and down and up and down, and you never know from one day to the next what Gilligan is going to be thinking or what he's going to be doing. Is that what you're going to be? If you were suddenly stranded on this island after life was so wonderful for you, it went from the tremendous down to the traumatic, how would you behave? Or maybe there's other things that would happen. Maybe you would be so depressed that you would just give up and die. So these are the two questions I want you to think about. How would you behave if suddenly your world changed and you went from what was tremendous down to the traumatic? And why would you behave the way that you behave? So this morning we're talking a little bit about Jurassic World, and I had the opportunity this past week to go and watch Jurassic World. And we went and we came here into the theater, and I sat down in one of the beautiful seats that they have in the other theaters, the kind that you can press a button and suddenly you go back and your feet go up. And it was a really nice theater, very comfortable. That this theater is going to be like that at some point in time. The theater that we normally operate out is going to be like that at some point in time. So we'll have to talk a little bit about how many people suddenly go back and listen to the pastor while they're looking up at the screen. But we'll talk about that later. But it was a great time for me, and I sat down in that chair, and my wife was sitting next to me, and she reached over and she grabbed my hand to hold my hand. And I thought, cool. This is pretty cool. I almost forgot I was going to watch a movie. Because, she was holding my hand. Wow. I thought that's pretty. We've been married for 33 years. We've been married for 33 years, right? Yeah, so 33 years. And that doesn't happen all the time as your later years of being married. So I was excited. And so then the movie began, and we were watching the movie, and all the dinosaurs came out, and things got more tense. And suddenly this hand holding that was going on is my fingers were getting crushed. It was getting tighter and getting tighter, and I had my wedding ring on, and I was trying to move my fingers so my wedding ring wouldn't cut my other finger, and it just kept getting tighter and tighter. So it was a great time for me to be able to watch Jurassic World. But when I watched it, this whole thought process came to my mind as to how is it that we behave when suddenly things go from the tremendous to the traumatic. So if you remember Jurassic Park took place in, I believe, 1993, and it was a wonderful adventure where a group of people were able to come to this island, and they were going to see this wonderful organization that had been put together, this like theme park where people could come and they could take a look at the dinosaurs. They used genetic splicing. They built or made or created all of these dinosaurs, and they were running wild on this island, and they were within gates and electrical fencing and all that kind of thing, and all the technology was absolutely wonderful, and it was a great thing. And they would get into these cars, and these cars would automatically go down the roads, and they would be able to look to the right and to the left and see all these dinosaurs, and it was just this wonderful program. And actually, if you take a look at it, things were absolutely wonderful at that time. Millions of dollars had been put into that. But what happened? Suddenly, something went wrong, and the technology didn't work anymore, and the people were now running for their lives, and people were getting eaten by dinosaurs. And now we get the opportunity to be able to see how people are going to behave when they're in a crisis, when life suddenly changes dramatically for them, and now they have to make decisions on their own. Who are they going to become? Why are they going to behave the way that they do? And so these people were smart people, and they used their intellect, and they tried to figure out how they were going to get from one place to another, and eventually they survived in that movie. And by the way, there was a beautiful blonde in this movie. Then we go to the second one, and it was Jurassic the Lost Kingdom, and it was back in 1997, I believe, that this one came out, and it was a different island that was full of a whole bunch of dinosaurs, and all they were going to do was just come down there and categorize them, take pictures of them, try to determine how the animals were actually going to live. And so they spent time doing that. They had everything planned. They came across in this beautiful RV full of all of this wonderful equipment. It was all technology based. They had no problems. They had no fears. They thought this was going to be pretty cool. And so what ends up happening? Their technology fails on them. Dinosaurs start attacking them, and suddenly the world comes to an end for them. It went from tremendous to traumatic, and they had to behave in a certain way in order to survive. And so again, it was their intelligence, but their desire to be able to survive. In many ways, it was their brute strength. It was just an event where they did live, and they lived through this whole thing. And oh, by the way, there was a beautiful blonde in this movie also. And we go on to the third one, and the third one is Jurassic Park 3. And Jurassic Park 3 is where there was a dad who was with his son, and they were parasailing, and as they were parasailing, the boat that was pulling them disappeared into a fog, and they were let loose, and they parasailed onto the land, and they got stuck in a tree, and the son was able to survive. The dad died. But then what ends up happening is that there's a group of people who use all this great technology to come down to try to find their son. And so they searched throughout the wilderness for that son, but they thought they had this because they had all the right technology, and they had all the right weapons, and they had the whole right everything, and then they crash into a tree, and they're in the middle of the island, and now they've got to make it out again. Same story. It's happened, all the other ones, same kind of story, and people get eaten by dinosaurs, and they finally learn what is important in their life because they were trying to search for that son, and they would do anything in order to find him. The reason they behaved the way they did, out of the love for their son. And oh, by the way, there was a beautiful blonde in this particular movie also. And then we go to Jurassic World. And Jurassic World was this big theme park. And everything was this wonderful theme park. And I'm not going to tell you everything in case you want to go see it. But what ends up happening is, things don't work out quite the way they want to, and they're being chased by dinosaurs, and people are getting eaten, and they learn how to survive in this kind of situation. And oh, by the way, there was a beautiful blonde in this one also. So, it just was the same. Each one of these movies were the same. 1, 2, 3, 4 were all the same. But what was interesting about all of this is that it took a look at what people's behavior is like when life suddenly gets bad. Now, as I was thinking more about this, there's nothing that these movies today have on what has taken place many, many years ago. And so what I want to do is I want to tell you some stories about movies that could have been made thousands of years ago in a book called the Bible. And those stories are out of the Bible. For most of you who know me, you know that what I really love to do is to be able to go into the Bible and to learn about the Bible and to learn how this Bible all fits together. And so we're going to talk about Judges this morning, the book of Judges. Now, this isn't a book that everybody likes to read, and they often bypass it, and I don't know why, because there is a lot of cool stuff in here. It makes getting eaten by a dinosaur look very minor compared to some of the things that you read in these stories in the book of Judges. Now, let me help you figure out what Judges is all about, and let me quickly go through what you might look at as God's redemptive plan here in the Bible. And we'll start with Abraham. And very simply, Abraham was asked by God to please leave his country and go to another land that he has never gone to before. So what did Abraham do? Abraham suddenly had to change his whole life, and he went from the tremendous, being wealthy and being well known in his city, to the traumatic, where he had to leave and go to another country, and that's where he lived out his life. But that country was where God wanted him to be, and that country was ultimately going to be classified as the land of Canaan. And so that's where Abraham went. And God promised Abraham, out of you, you will have ancestors that will be greater than the sand on the seashores, will be greater than the stars in the sky. And Abraham believed it all, even though he had one son that was part of that covenant. And then we go on to another generation, to Isaac, and then the next generation to Jacob. And Jacob had more of a family, and he had about 70 people in his family. And he moved his family from the land of Canaan to Egypt because there was a famine. And when he moved his family to the land of Egypt, he was protected by a person by the name of Joseph, which was his son, because Joseph was a major leader in Egypt. And it was a wonderful time for the Israelites in the land of Egypt because they had wonderful land in order to have crops and wonderful land to be able to be the kind of people that they wanted to be. But ultimately, the pharaohs forgot who Joseph was and forgot who the Israelites were really about. And so 400 years the Israelites were in the land of Egypt. 400 years they were in the land of Egypt. And they were then praying to God, get us out of here. Do something, help us. Life is so tough. And so God sent Moses, and Moses came and he delivered the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. And they crossed the desert for many, many years. And then they ended up where? In the land of Canaan. These are all the ancestors of Abraham. This is what God promised Abraham many, many years ago. And now through all these generations, all these Israelites, totaling a couple million, went into the land of Canaan. Isn't that pretty exciting? And that's what all these stories are about here in the Bible. And it talks about that whole redemptive plan. And so now the Israelites are all in the land of Canaan. And they're living there. And they're praising God. And they believe in God. And they're praying to God. And they're doing all the things that they're supposed to do for several years. For generation after generation. But you know what? There was a guy by the name of Joseph. And he died, Joshua, and he died. And at that point in time, the people now suddenly forgot who God was. Totally forgot who God was. And they no longer worshiped this God. They worshiped the idols of the people that were still living in the land. And because they no longer worshiped God, their life definitely went from tremendous to traumatic. And now they behaved in a very unique way. I want to be able to tell you exactly what it is that Judges says, a book in the Bible, about the Israelites. And I'm going to read Judges 2, 10 through 19. And after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them, and they aroused the Lord's anger, because they forsook him and served the Baals and the Ashtaroths. And in his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. And yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. And they quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commandments. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judges died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. And they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So if you take a look at the Bible, it goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and then Judges. And Judges is the book where it talks about how evil the Israelites were and how God took judges, individual people, and used them in order to save the Israelites from their own evilness. And so in all of that, I'm going to tell you 4 simple stories this morning that are far better than Jurassic Park, far better than what most stories are around here, but a lot of stories that most of you don't even realize are in there. And I have, quite often, I have an enjoyment to be able to appeal a little bit more to the male mind and to the male thought process. So see if you can figure out where I'm going with this as I continue on this morning. So the first movie, as you might say, a biblical movie, was made in 1350 BC. And that's the story of a guy by the name of Ehud and the Moabites. So let me tell you a little bit about that story. When Ehud was part of the Israelites, what his responsibility to do was to be able to take large sums of money or whatever it might be and bring it to the Moabites. He would bring it to the king, and he would stop in and see the king and deliver him all of these goods. Well, the Israelites had to do that because they wanted to survive. They wanted to live. They were underneath the thumb of the king of the Moabites. So what was it that he ultimately did? Well, just to explain it a little bit, I think it is very fascinating. What he did is he made himself a sword, a double-edged sword. And what he did is he put it on his right side and he had it tied to his leg. And it was underneath his clothes that he wore at that point in time. And so he came in to see that particular king. And if you read the story in the Bible, you will read that story, and that story will say that he's a left-handed man. And they keep talking about the fact that he's a left-handed man. And most people are wondering, who cares if he's a left-handed man? Well, most people were right-handed back in those days, as most people are right-handed nowadays. So if you came in and you saw a king, you would wear a sword on your right-hand side. Your left-hand side, sorry. You would wear a sword on your left-hand side. Because when you pulled out that sword and you were right-handed, you had to pull it out this way to pull it out. So most people weren't left-handed, so when you walked in, you didn't have a sword on your left-hand side. They figured you didn't have any weapon with you. And so that's the way that he was being able to get in to the king by actually carrying a weapon on his right-hand side. See, he was left-handed. He could then pull it out using his left-handed. Part of my law enforcement career, way back in the beginning, they had the cross-draw weapon where you would have it on this side if you were right-handed, and you would grab it and you would pull it out. That's the same thought process that they had back in those days. So he came in and he had his whole entourage with him, and he went up to the king and he said, "King, here's your money and here's your goods and here's all the gifts from the Israelites." And the king was, really happy with all of this. And the king was a really fat man. Really, really fat man. And so then what he did is then he left the king's presence and he walked out of the palace and he walked into the town, but then he turned around and he came back to the king. And he says, I have a very secretive type message that I need to give you. And I need to give you that message because it comes from our God. And the king was excited about that, so he had everybody leave from where his throne was sitting, and everybody left. And Ehud came up to the king and walked right up next to him to give him this message. And then he used that left hand and he pulled out that sharp sword and he slid it through the stomach of that king. In fact, it slid in so far that the fat of the king went over top of the sword and he lost the sword inside the king. It says it. Really, honestly. It says it. This is a story in the Bible. Wouldn't that be a lot better movie? than some of the movies they showed. I think that'd be pretty cool. But that's the story that you find in Judges. And what he did then at that point in time is he locked the doors to where the king was, and he left. And people thought, why isn't the king coming out? They thought he was using the bathroom. And so they very, awkwardly waited a while and kept waiting and thinking, boy, he really had to go. And finally, he didn't come out, so they went and got a key, and they opened up the door, and they went in there, and they found their king dead. But that gave Ehud the time to be able to get back to where he needed to be able to muster a whole bunch of his army and take and attack then the Moabites. And what happens? He defeated the Moabites. And now Israelites are living again in harmony, back into the life that they originally had. See, every single one of these stories begins with a verse. And that verse talks about, as we see on the screen, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. That's how this story started. That's what you read in the Bible. But now that I've told you the story, how did it end? The way it ends is from Judges 3, verse 30, and it said, that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. So if you were to take a look at this story and you see that God was with Ehud, why did he behave in the manner that he did? See, life was good. He went from the tremendous, went down to the traumatic. Life became awful. And God used him to be able to save the Israelites. Why did he behave in the manner in which he behaved? It's because the faith that he had in God. He behaved the way he did because the faith that he had in God. Let me tell you another story. This is Deborah and the Canaanites. And I wanted to use this particular story in Judges. There's many stories, but I wanted to use this particular one because it deals with a woman and her involvement in this whole life of the Israelites and how God used a woman in order to save the Israelites. It does happen. So many people think that the Bible is only about men, but it's not. It's about women too. You just need to read the stories. There's so many of the stories. We don't read the stories. But if you did, you would understand that women were just as important as men in the Bible in a lot of these things. So Deborah, what she did is she got a hold of the army's captain and said, come and see me. And so he came and saw her. And she said to him, I want you to take your army and I want you to go out and I want you to go ahead and defeat the Canaanites because God is going to be with you. And he looks at her and said, well, how can I be sure this is going to happen? And Deborah says, I am a prophet. She was a prophet at that time. I talk directly to God. God has told me that you need to go ahead and defeat the Canaanites. And so what he did is he said, I'll go and defeat the Canaanites, but I need you to be with me. I will not go alone. And Deborah looks at him and says, well, if I go along with you, then you will not get the acclamation for your defeat of the Canaanites. It is going to be a woman who's going to be getting that kind of excitement where people are going to praise a woman for what has taken place. And he said, that's okay, come with me. So they got a lot of their men put together and their army went out and the army fought with the Canaanites. And they were defeating the Canaanites like crazy. And they were chasing them across the country. And they totally defeated them except for the captain of the Canaanite army. He was on a dead run. He was going like crazy. He was trying to get away. And he got away for a period of time. And he met up with people that he knew, that they were friends of him, that were classified as family of his. And he was exhausted, and he was hungry, and he was thirsty, and he couldn't run anymore. And he knew that the Israelites were coming after him. And so he asked this lady, can I be in your tent? Can I sleep in your tent? And she says, yes, come on in, lay down, sleep. And so he laid down and he went to sleep, and he woke up a little bit later and asked for something to drink. And she came and she brought him something to drink. And he went back to sleep again. And what did this lady do? Something that you may never see in a movie. But what she did is she took a stake out of the tent, and she took a hammer, and she laid it on the temple of this captain of the Canaanites' army, and drilled that stake through the temple of that captain into the ground. And so who was celebrated at that time? It was the lady who put the spike through the temple of that captain. Would any of you be able to do that? I hope not. But look at this. This is the part that you just need to understand, is that her behavior was not based on her brute strength. Her behavior wasn't based on her good looks. Her behavior was not based on her intellect. Her behavior was based on the faith that she had in God. And that's why she did what she did. So her behavior was based on that faith. I want to tell you another story. Another story is about Gideon. And many of you know the story of Gideon. And Gideon was able to meet up with an angel. And he talked with an angel. And an angel was encouraging him to go ahead and defeat the Midianites. And Gideon didn't know for sure who this person was that was talking to him. So he brought out some food to this person. And this person again was an angel. And what the angel did then is touched that food with his rod. And it burned up. And at that time, the angel disappeared. And so what Gideon felt at this time was this really was words from God. But you know, when we hear words from God, or when we know sometimes what is the right thing to do, we still wonder. We still question. We still don't know for sure if this is really what it is that God wants us to do. And so what ends up happening in this case is that Gideon takes a fleece from a sheep, and he lays it out on the ground, and he asks God, you know, what I'd love it to be able to do is when the dew comes down in the morning, make the fleece wet, but make everything dry around it. That's almost impossible. But he asked God to do that. So what happened in the next morning? What happens is the fleece is dry, or the fleece is wet, and the dew and the ground all around it is perfectly dry. Well, he goes the other way around with the fleece the next night and said, well, can you make the fleece perfectly dry and the ground wet all over the place? And that's what happened. God did. And so he knew that God was with him. And so he took 32,000 of his men, and he went to battle with the Midianites. But God said, you know what? If you go with 32,000 men and you defeat the Midianites, you guys are going to think that you're something special. And I don't want you to think that you're something special. So I want you to cut down the number of men that you're going to go defeat them with. And so what he does is he asks, who are you here that are afraid of the Midianites, that are in fear of them? Go home. And 22,000 of his 32,000 people left. And so he only had 10,000 left. And so he is getting closer to the Midianites, and he gets closer to the Midianites, and God said, you know what? You're going to think somehow or another that you had the ability to defeat the Midianites because of the number of people that you have. And so I want you to cut down the number of people that you have. I want you to go down to a river, and whoever scoops up the water and laps it like a dog, those are the ones you're going to keep. The rest of the people can go home who get on their hands and knees and drink directly from the river. And the only people he had left after that was 300 people. So Gideon now, if he didn't have it before, has total and complete faith in God. It's not his behavior. It's not his ability. See, his life was wonderful again. His life was really good before the Midianites took over his life and the life of the Israelites. And so now he has to behave in a certain way. And why is he behaving in that way? He's behaving in that way because he has this faith. And so 300 people went and battled against thousands of Midianites, and they won. And the Midianites all seemed to be battling with each other. And Gideon was the hero in this story. But really, It was God who was the hero in the story. The last story that I'm going to tell you is Samson. Everybody knows the story of Samson. Samson was one of the judges. His stories are in Judges, in the book of Judges. That's where you see all of these stories. And there's more. There's more stories. You need to be able to go back and read the whole book of Judges because it's pretty cool. And guys, it's a pretty cool thing to read. Quite often we hear that the Christian religion is all for women and it's only a women's religion. Let me tell you, it is not even in the slightest. There is so many cool things in the Bible that really attract men, and the ability of men to go to war for their families is something that is talked about here in the Bible all the time. So the last story is about Samson. And again, Samson was born to parents that an angel happened to come and meet. And the angel told Samson, you know what? Or told Samson's parents, you know what? This is going to be a special child for me. I want you to treat him in a special way. And I don't want you to cut his hair. I want you to let it grow. And then he will be a special child for me. So as Samson grew up, he started to learn that he was going to battle the Philistines. His job was to protect the Israelites from the Philistines. See, again, the Israelites had this wonderful life. And then again, they went and worshipped idols. And their life changed and it went from the tremendous to the traumatic. And so God then took a person out of that life. And that was Samson. And Samson's responsibility was to make a difference for the Israelites. And so he first ended up going to a wedding. And during that wedding, he told everybody a riddle. And he says, if you can solve this riddle, then I will give you 30 articles of clothing. Well, the people were able to solve the riddle. And so what Samson did is he went and killed 30 Philistines. And he took their clothes off and gave those clothes to the people who answered the riddle. But that's not just the only story that Samson had. Samson went to a city and they wanted to get Samson. And so they were hidden out around the city waiting for him to come out because they wanted to kill Samson. And they were waiting. Most people didn't travel at night, so they were waiting for him to come out in the morning. And when the sun rose, they found that the city gates had been lifted up and carried up the mountain. And that was Samson. That's how powerful and how strong he was. And so what they did is they came out with 3,000 men. Imagine this. 3,000 men who were going to go ahead and try to take Samson alive. 3,000 men against one person. Doesn't sound really fair, but what ends up happening is that Samson kills 1,000 of those Philistines, and the other 2,000 ran from one person. The stories like that continue on with Samson as to all the different things he did. But ultimately, as many of you know, he had this run-in with Delilah. And Delilah was the one who was ultimately his downfall. And they cut his hair and he became weak and they gouged out his eyes. And he became a person to ridicule when the Philistines were in their temple worshiping their God. Well, one day he was standing between two pillars and he prayed to God and asked God to give him that strength one last time. And he pushed the pillars apart and the whole building came down and killed thousands upon thousands of Philistines. And so the life of the Israelites became better because of Samson. So look at these stories. These are the stories that we could write movies on that took place in this Bible. But there's something different, something majorly different between the stories of Jurassic Park and the stories of the Bible. Because the stories of Jurassic Park are all about our own strength, about our own intelligence, about all those things that we know about in our culture that people accept as the reasons why they behave the way that they behave. That's what these movies are all about. But when you look at the Bible and you look at all the stories of the Bible, it is all about the faith of people. All about the faith of those special people whose life was wonderful at one time, became incredibly bad, and used their faith in God in order to make a difference. I want you to hear about what Hebrews 11 has to say about all of this. Hebrews 11 takes all of what I said this morning and puts it together in such a wonderful, wonderful way. And Hebrews 11, what I'm to read you are just some of the verses in Hebrews 11, but it gives you an idea what I'm talking about this morning. And in verse 1 it says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So our faith is about what we see in this Bible. That's where we get our faith from. These are the stories. These are the promises. This is the redemptive history. And as redemptive history means, it is a story from the beginning of time to the time when Jesus was born, to the time that Jesus died, to the time that Jesus arose and ascended into heaven. Story after story after story. And we read this all so we know the whole history and the whole line of Jesus because of this. And we believe it. We believe all that's in it. Even though we never met Jesus personally, other than spiritually, we never saw him personally. And we talk about heaven, and we've never seen heaven, but we believe in it. We believe in it all because we believe what's in this Bible. It's all about faith, not the junk that you see in the movies today or the humor that you see in something like Gilligan's Island. Let me continue on. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. That's what faith is all about. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. That's all about faith. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, he who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. And when you read this, again, it is the faith that Abraham had, and he was going to kill his son, but God stopped him and he didn't. But he would have because of that faith. And by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and that they were not afraid of the king's edict to kill all the children at that time. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. It's all about faith. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about what's in Judges, about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in desert and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. And they did all this for the sake of Christ. And they did this because of the faith that they had in Christ. It is about faith. It is not about about your brute strength. It is not about how good you look. It is not about how smart you are. It is not about how intelligent you are. It is not how much you control your emotions. None of this stuff has anything to do with anything. It is the faith that you have in God. So I want to finish this morning with another question. I started out with a couple. I'm full of questions today. And so I'm going to leave you with a question. And I want you to think about this question as you leave this auditorium. And I want you to think about this question as you get in your incredibly hot car and drive towards home, as you've got the air conditioner blowing like crazy. I want you to continue to think about this question tonight as you're at the beach, or as you're at a restaurant, or you're watching the next movie that I'm going to be preaching on next week, or whatever it is that you're going to be doing tonight. I want you to think about this last question, and this last question is what you see on the screen, and it says, by faith, how would you behave if your life just changed from tremendous to traumatic? Shall we pray? Lord, so much of what our culture tells us today is that it is all about us. It is all about our abilities. It is about our brute strength. It is about our good looks. It is about our intelligence. It is about all the things that really don't matter. Because what matters the most is the faith that we have in you. It is about the faith that we see in the Bible from so many different people who were involved in so many different things, and what they did, the story of their life, the reason they behaved the way they did was because of their faith in you. Lord, all the people here this morning, they're worried in many ways about so many things that happen in their life. They're worried about their jobs, and they're worried about their relationships, and they're worried about sometimes where their next food is going to come from, or how it is that they're going to pay for their apartments. And Lord, all of these are honest worries. But Lord, more than anything else, may the Spirit move this morning in such a way that the faith that the people have in who you are come out to be the powerful thought in their life. And that when they think about this faith, and they think about you, and they think about living a life for you, that all of these problems and all these issues will start fading away, and that you will become the front of their lives. Lord, this morning, may this last question live on the hearts of the people this morning as they try to figure out where their faith is, how strong their faith is, what is it that they actually believe. And if someday, when they're in this wonderful life, and for whatever reason it turns traumatic, Lord, will that faith come forward and carry them through? Lord, be with the Source Church, and be with the carrying out of Christ's Word. In Jesus' name we pray this morning.